If you'd come through the valley in the dry season of 1887, you would have seen something strange. You would have seen a woman, alone, walking the scorched property lines with a wheelbarrow. Every few days, she'd load an old, rusted irrigation pipe onto it and push it back to the small barn that sagged beside her saltbox house. The pipes were junk. They were the failed experiments of her neighbors, torn out and discarded when their own dreams of bringing water to the high acres had turned to rust and dust. They lay in gullies and at the edges of fallow fields, monuments to futility. But she collected them. Agnes moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm that defied the oppressive heat. She wore her late husband's canvas work shirt, the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and a flat-brimmed hat that cast her face in permanent shadow. The town of Redemption, a dusty collection of buildings a few miles down the road, watched her. At first, it was a curiosity. Then, a quiet joke. Men at the general store would lean against the counter and speculate. Lost her senses after Samuel passed, one might say. Another would add, piling up scrap. Reckon she aims to build a monument to bad ideas. They saw a widow, frail and lost in her grief, engaging in a meaningless, repetitive task. They saw a collection of rust. They didn't see a plan. Because the plan wasn't for them. It was a quiet conversation she was having with the land, a promise whispered to the baked clay under her feet. And as the pile of discarded metal grew behind her barn, so did the whispers. But Agnes didn't hear them. She heard only the scrape of metal on the dry earth and the steady, patient beat of her own heart. She was collecting memories of failures, but she wasn't building a monument. She was building a future. And if you're the kind of person who sees potential where others only see trash, you'll want to see how she did it. It had started the year before, in the silence that followed Samuel's funeral. The silence was the worst part. It was heavier than the grief, thicker than the dust that settled on every surface of the house. The ranch had been his dream, a quarter section of stubborn land that promised little and gave less. He had seen a future in it, a vision of green fields and a flowing creek. But the creek had dwindled to a muddy trickle each summer, and the well they depended on was a deep, grudging thing, offering up just enough water to keep them alive, but not enough for the land to thrive. He had spent years trying to fix it. He dug ditches by hand, trying to coax water from the distant spring, but the sun baked them dry. He'd bought expensive new irrigation pipes, the kind the land agent from the city recommended, but the pressure was never right, and the joints always failed. His last project, a network of metal arteries meant to feed the west pasture, now lay in a heap by the fence line, a testament to his final, exhausted defeat. After he was gone, Agnes walked that fence line every day. She looked at the cracked earth, the brittle stalks of last year's corn, and the pile of useless pipes. The land was a reflection of her own emptiness. For months, she did nothing but the essential chores, tending the chickens, mending the fences, drawing the daily water from the resentful well. Then one morning, a windstorm blew through, shifting the dust and debris. It uncovered a single, short section of pipe Samuel had discarded years earlier, half buried near the small spring-fed pond at the highest point of their property. It was angled just so, pointing downhill toward the house. Rainwater from the night before had collected in its rusted channel and trickled out the other end, leaving a small, dark patch of damp earth. That was all it was. A trickle of water. A patch of mud. But for Agnes, it was a revelation. Samuel had always tried to fight the land, to force the water uphill, to impose a system on a place that resisted it. He had the right tools but the wrong idea. She looked from the high pond down to the thirsty field behind her house. It wasn't about pressure. It wasn't about force. It was about surrender. It was about gravity. The collection became her singular focus. It was a scavenger's work, a slow and patient reclamation of other people's failures. She started with the pipes on her own property, the one Samuel had left behind. She used a crowbar and a block of wood to pry them from the hardened earth, the shriek of metal a lonely sound in the vast quiet. Then she hitched her old mule, Beatrice, to the buckboard and began to explore the surrounding country. She knew the stories of every abandoned homestead, every dried-up claim. She followed the ghost trails of men who, like her husband, had come with grand ambitions and left with broken spirits. Their discarded pipes were still there, half swallowed by sagebrush and time. She asked for nothing, simply loaded what was clearly abandoned onto her wagon. The work was brutal. The metal was heavy, awkward, and sharp with rust. It snagged her clothes and sliced her hands, leaving a crosshatch of red lines on her calloused skin. But each piece she salvaged was a victory. Each length of pipe was a sentence in the story she was writing. At the county dump, she found a tangle of metal, a chaotic mess of different gauges and materials. The man who ran the place, a weary fellow named Peterson, just waved a hand. "Take it. Saves me the trouble of burying it," he watched, bemused, as she spent 2 days methodically untangling the heap, sorting the pieces by size and shape. Her pile behind the barn grew from a heap into a carefully organized library of rust. There were long, straight sections, curved elbows, T-joints, and reducers. Each one had a history, a past life in a failed system. In town, she approached Mr. Gable, the owner of the general store and smithy, a man whose opinions were as solid and unmoving as his anvil. He had a pile of scrap metal behind his shop. "I'll give you 10 cents a foot for the pipe," she said, her voice even and low. He looked at her, then at the pile of junk. "What for, Agnes?" "Building a scrap heap to rival the county's." "I have a use for it," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Fine. It's your money to waste." He took her coins and watched her load the heavy, awkward pieces herself. He shook his head and went back inside, telling the story to the next customer who came through the door. The whole valley was watching her build her collection of folly. With her collection complete, the real work began. She laid the pieces out in the parched field behind the house, arranging them like the bones of some great metal serpent. Her plan, born from that single trickle of water, was simple in concept: create a gravity-fed drip irrigation system. She would run a main line from the small, elevated pond down to the field, then branch off with smaller pipes that would deliver a slow, steady supply of water directly to the base of each plant she intended to grow. The simplicity of the idea was deceptive. The reality was a nightmare of mismatched parts. The pipes were from a dozen different manufacturers, made over 2 decades. Diameters varied by fractions of an inch. Threads were stripped or rusted solid. None of it fit. Her first attempts at joining them were exercises in frustration. She tried to force them together using a heavy mallet, but the old metal was brittle and cracked under the strain. She packed the joints with clay from the creek bed, just as she'd seen Samuel do, but when she poured a test bucket of water into the top of the line, it leaked from every connection, a dozen tiny weeping sores that bled water into the dust. The ground around her feet turned to a slick, useless mud while the end of the pipe remained bone dry. The water pressure, even with the gentle slope, was too much for the weak seals. One afternoon, Mr. Davies, the county water commissioner, made a special trip out to her ranch. He was a kind man, but a conventional one, a man who believed in regulations and approved methods. He'd heard the talk in town. He saw her patchwork of pipes and the muddy puddles. "Agnes," he said, his voice full of gentle pity. "This is admirable, but it won't work. The soil is too porous, and you'll never get a proper seal on this old junk." He gestured to the field. "The best thing, the only thing, is to dig a new well. Deeper. We can help you survey a spot." He was offering the standard solution, the expensive, brute force answer. "I believe this will work," she said quietly, not looking at him, her eyes fixed on a stubborn, leaking joint. "It's a waste of your time and energy," he sighed. Samuel tried. "You can't make water do what it doesn't want to." He tipped his hat and left, convinced he had tried his best to help a grieving, confused woman. That evening, Agnes sat on her porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. She looked at her leaking, failed system. Mr. Davies was wrong. Samuel had been wrong. It wasn't about making water do what it didn't want to. It was about asking it nicely. There was one person in the valley who didn't deal in pity or conventional wisdom. Mr. Abernathy lived 2 miles down the road on a small plot of land that was always, unaccountably, greener than its surroundings. He was nearly 80, with hands like gnarled oak roots and eyes that had seen 70 years of sun and drought. He had retired from farming decades ago, but he still moved with the rhythms of the land. Agnes found him sitting on his porch, watching the hawks circle in the updrafts. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply nodded toward the other rocking chair. She sat, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was different from the one in her house. This was a comfortable, knowing silence. Finally, she spoke. "The pipes leak," he nodded slowly, still watching the sky. "Water's tricky," he said. "It wants to be free. You try to cage it, it'll always find a way out." Agnes took a stick and began to draw in the dust at her feet, sketching her system, the high pond, the main line, the branches. He watched her drawing take shape, his eyes following the lines she traced. He didn't laugh. He didn't offer advice about wells. When she was finished, he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Your grade is right," he observed. "You understand the slope. That's more than most men figure out. But you're thinking about the pipes. You should be thinking about the earth." He explained that the clay she was using was too pure. On its own, it would dry and crack. He told her about the old ways, the methods his own father had used before manufactured pipes were common. He spoke of mixing the clay with sand to give it body, and then, the secret ingredient, tallow. Rendered animal fat. "It keeps the clay from cracking," he said. "Makes it waterproof. You pack that mixture into the joints, then you wrap them in burlap. And you don't lay the pipe on the ground. You bury it. The earth itself holds it together. The weight of the soil becomes your friend. It presses down on the seals and keeps the water in." He looked at her diagram again. "You're not building a machine, Agnes. You're adding a vein to the body of the land. You have to treat it that way." The next morning, Agnes began again. Armed with Mr. Abernathy's quiet wisdom, she saw the project not as an assembly of metal parts, but as a collaboration with the earth itself. The pace of her work changed. It was no longer a fight. It was a slow, methodical process, a ritual. She started by digging a shallow trench, following the path she had laid out. The digging was back-breaking, the sun relentless. She used a simple line level, a length of horsehair rope tied between 2 stakes with a stone hanging from the center, to ensure the grade was consistent, a gentle, almost imperceptible slope away from the pond. Every foot of the trench was a negotiation with the soil, which ranged from soft loam to rock-hard clay. Then came the sealing of the joints. She built a fire and rendered the fat from a side of bacon she had cured, the smell filling the still air. She mixed the hot tallow with clay and sand in a large wooden bucket, kneading the strange, pliable substance with her bare hands until it was the consistency of thick dough. One by one, she took the mismatched pipes and applied the mixture to the threads and junctions. She didn't try to force them. Instead, she coaxed them together, filling the gaps with the tallow clay mixture. She then wrapped each seal joint tightly with strips of burlap she had cut from old sacks. It was slow, messy, painstaking work. The sun rose and set, marking her progress in the lengthening shadows of the trench. Her brother-in-law, Frank, rode out one afternoon from his own prosperous ranch on the other side of the county. He saw the trenches, the strange-looking pipes, and the woman covered in dirt and grease. He shook his head, his expression a mixture of pity and exasperation. "What in God's name are you building, Agnes?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of familial authority. She looked up from her work, wiping a smudge of clay from her cheek with the back of her hand. Her answer was simple, direct, and offered no room for argument. A garden. Frank stayed for another 10 minutes, offering unsolicited advice about selling the ranch and moving into town, before finally riding off, convinced his brother's wife had succumbed to sun-addled grief. Agnes didn't watch him go. She was already fitting the next piece of pipe into place. The system was finally complete. Every pipe was joined, sealed, and wrapped. Every inch of the metal serpent lay nestled in its shallow grave of earth. Agnes had packed the soil back into the trenches, tamping it down firmly with her feet and the back of a shovel, until the only visible signs of her work were a faint scar on the land and the single, upright pipe with a simple gate valve that rose from the edge of the pond. This was the heart of the system. From here, the water would begin its slow, gravitational journey. Her hands trembled slightly as she took hold of the rusted wheel on the valve. This was the moment of truth. She had spent months collecting, digging, and sealing. She had poured all of her hope into this network of junk. She turned the wheel. It resisted, groaning with rust and disuse, then gave way with a shudder. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she heard it, a low gurgle, the sound of water entering the main pipe, a sound she had been dreaming of for months. She walked the length of the main line, her ear close to the ground, listening to the water moving beneath the surface. It was a faint, subterranean whisper, the lifeblood flowing through the veins she had created. But when she reached the field where the smaller distribution pipes branched out, the sound faded. She waited. Nothing. No dark patches of moisture appeared in the soil. The ends of the feeder pipes, barely visible at the surface, remained dry. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. She walked the line again, pressing her hand to the ground, trying to feel for a leak, for the telltale dampness of failure. Near the middle of the field, she found it. The ground was soft. Spongy. A section of the trench had collapsed inward, likely crushing the pipe and creating a blockage. The water was pooling underground, turning her carefully packed earth into a hidden swamp. The whispers from town echoed in her head. A waste of time. A fool's errand. She looked at the vast, silent field under the unforgiving sun. To fix it, she would have to dig it all up again. For the first time, she felt the immense weight of her exhaustion, and a sliver of despair pierced her patient resolve. Agnes stood over the soggy patch of earth, the site of the collapse, and felt the temptation to simply walk away. She could go back to the house, back to the quiet, managed grief she had known before this mad project began. No one would blame her. They would nod knowingly and say she had finally come to her senses. But then she looked at her hands. They were not the hands of the woman she had been a year ago. They were stained with earth and tallow, crisscrossed with scars, the palms thick with calluses. These were hands that had worked. They had hefted iron and moved earth. They would not be defeated by a bit of mud. She picked up her shovel. The work of unearthing the pipe was harder this time. The soil was heavy and wet, clinging to the shovel in thick, sucking clumps. But she was methodical. She didn't rush. She dug carefully, exposing the buried line section by section until she found the problem. A large rock, hidden just beneath the surface, had been dislodged by the water's flow and had crushed a section of the main pipe. The clay tallow seal had held, but the brittle iron had not. It was not a failure of her method, but a failure of foresight. She hadn't accounted for the instability of the soil itself. The solution, like the problem, came from the land. She spent the next 2 days hauling stones from the dry creek bed in her wheelbarrow. She dug a wider, deeper trench around the damaged section, laying a bed of these smooth, flat stones to create a stable foundation. She found a spare piece of pipe in her collection, cut it to length with a hacksaw, and carefully sealed it into place, using extra layers of the burlap and tallow mixture. This time, she reinforced the entire junction with more stones, building a small, sturdy cairn around the pipe before burying it again. She packed the earth around it, layer by layer, creating a solid, immovable housing. When she was done, she walked back to the pond. Her body ached with a fatigue so deep it felt like it had settled in her bones. She took a deep breath and turned the valve. Again, the gurgle. She walked the line, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She reached the field. And there, at the base of a small stick she had planted to mark the spot, a dark circle of moisture was spreading in the dust. A single, perfect drop of water welled up from the end of a feeder pipe and fell onto the thirsty ground. Then another. And another. A slow, steady, life-giving pulse. The pipes vanished. Buried and forgotten beneath the soil, the network of rust became invisible. The scar on the land healed, covered first by weeds, then by the tender green shoots Agnes planted. She worked from dawn until dusk, sowing seeds of corn, squash, and beans in neat rows that followed the hidden lines of her irrigation system. She moved with the same quiet determination that had guided her all along, her focus absolute. At first, no one in town noticed. Her ranch was set back from the main road, and her project had become old news, another of the valley's cautionary tales. But as the summer wore on, a change began to occur that was impossible to ignore. While the surrounding fields turned the familiar shades of pale yellow and brown, a patch of impossible green began to spread across Agnes's land. It wasn't the fleeting green of a spring morning, it was a deep, vibrant, living color that seemed to defy the season. Travelers on the road would slow their wagons, squinting at the sight. The talk in the general store shifted from amusement to baffled curiosity. Mr. Gable was the first to stop. He was on his way back from a delivery, and the sight of her field, shimmering in the midday heat, was so arresting he pulled his horse to a halt. The corn was already waist-high, its leaves a rich, dark green. The squash vines, thick and healthy, were snaking through the rows, their broad leaves shading the soil. It made no sense. There hadn't been a decent rain in over a month. He saw Agnes weeding around near the house and walked over, his boots kicking up dust. "Agnes," he said, his voice stripped of its usual mocking tone. "How is this possible?" She straightened up, wiping her brow with her forearm. "The soil is good," she said simply. "It's not that good," he countered. "Nobody's land is that good this time of year." A few days later, Mr. Davies, the water commissioner, returned. He had heard the rumors and had come to see for himself. He walked the edge of the field, his face a mask of professional disbelief. He knelt, picking up a handful of soil from the base of a corn stalk. It was cool and dark, perfectly moist. "Your well isn't strong enough for this," he stated, less a question than an accusation. "You must have found another water source." Agnes said nothing. She led him away from the field, toward the small, nearly invisible nub of pipe that stuck out of the ground near her porch, a secondary valve she had installed. She gave the wheel a slight turn. A moment later, they could see the effect in the field, a subtle darkening of the soil at the base of each plant as a fresh pulse of water was delivered. Davies stared, his mouth slightly agape. He followed the faint line in the earth back toward the pond on the hill. He finally looked at her, his eyes wide with a dawning, profound respect. "The pipes," he whispered. "I used the pipes. The harvest came." It was not just a harvest, it was a phenomenon. Agnes's corn grew taller and sweeter than anyone in the valley had ever seen. Her beans were plentiful, her squash so abundant she couldn't give them away fast enough. The field, born of rust and ridicule, had produced a miracle of abundance. Her small barn, once a repository for junk, was now filled to the rafters with food. The quiet, solitary woman had become the most successful farmer in the county, and she had done it with the things everyone else had thrown away. The people who had laughed now came to her gate, their wagons empty, their faces etched with the worry of a long, dry winter ahead. They didn't ask for handouts, they offered to buy her produce. Mr. Gable came, his hat in his hands, and offered her twice the going rate for her corn. She sold it to him for half. Frank, her brother-in-law, came and stood in stunned silence before the bounty, admitting he had never seen such a crop. She sent him home with his wagon so full the axles groaned. She gave food to Mr. Abernathy, who accepted it with a knowing, silent nod. She gave it to Mr. Davies. She left sacks of beans and squash on the porches of families she knew were struggling. She never mentioned their past mockery. She never spoke of her vindication. The crops were her only statement. Her success changed the valley. People started looking at their own land differently. They saw the gentle slopes, the unused springs, the potential they had overlooked in their quest for bigger wells and more powerful machines. They started to see that the answer wasn't always about force. Sometimes, it was about listening. Agnes's farm became a quiet testament to a different kind of thinking. It was a place that proved that patience could be more powerful than pressure, that gravity was a gift, and that the failures of the past could be the foundation of the future. As the writer and philosopher Elbert Hubbard once noted, the world is moving so fast these days that the man who says it can't be done is generally interrupted by someone doing it. Agnes had done it. She had listened to the land, trusted a simple idea, and turned a pile of rust into a revolution. And her story serves as a quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from a loud bang, but from a slow, persistent, life-giving drip. If you believe in the power of quiet ingenuity, let us know in the comments. And be sure to subscribe for more stories about the people who see the world not just for what it is, but for what it could be.